framed in Escola Massana in a design and art school from Barcelona, and funded with an Age 2020 European project called Helios. Basically, we are inviting different international experts every week to discuss about speculative theory and speculative practices, understanding those as levers for other worlds in a context of very profound social change, which is what's happening with COVID, all this savage uncertainty, and we want to take advantage of those open talks on Mondays to discuss about some of those issues. This week, in particularly, we wanted to invite Laura Forlano, social scientist and design researcher, interested in the entanglements between design practices, critical approaches on science and technology, ethics, aesthetics, and the production of the future, which is mostly what we are discussing here these 3 weeks of Post-Inertia. So, describing Laura implies a long list of interest, disciplines, and methods. She looks at the intersection between emerging technologies, material and discursive practices, and the future of cities. And specifically, she writes about emergent forms of work, socio-technical imaginaries, infrastructures, and urbanism, always from a critical point of view. In her research work, Laura converts different speculative, ethnographic, and inventive methods with the aim to create tools not only for inquiry the entanglements of the ever-changing socio-technical sphere, but also to intervene in it. And her presentation today will share some examples on like speculative projects and theoretical approach, which aim is to change the becomings. But before I give her the floor, I would like to highlight that she defines a designer as someone who builds and curates complex social, material, cultural, and technical networks with their political and ethical dimensions and implying diverse stakeholders. No? So the criteria, the role of the designer, it's not only to formalize, but to organize networks of materials, culture, infrastructures, practices, and so on. No? And her idea of approaching to the production of the future is very related to this idea of the designer as this curator of socio-technical networks. And that's especially important when we talk about like this very like tender conditions that we are living right now, where the world as we know as we know it can change very easily, no? If you want to make any questions or I don't know, just dialogue with other participants in the room, use the chat, and then we will collect them. We will gather the questions and we will transmit it to Laura to do something more or less organized. So, thank you very much, Laura, for being here with us, and we are looking forward to listen to you. Laura, I'm sorry, I'm not listening to you. Wait a moment, please. Hi, Laura?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, technical problems. I'm back.
Okay. Can you see the slides? Do you see the slides that I'm sharing or no?
No.
No? Okay,
No.
hearing the slides. But maybe I'll try that again. Let's see, hold on. Okay. Okay.
Now we see your screen.
Okay. Okay.
Cool.
So. Okay, so you can see the first slide and now the second slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with the summer school, and I look forward to hearing your questions and discussing with you. Just to let you know that while I'm speaking, I will be monitoring the chat box because I can only see the one screen at a time. But feel free to use the chat, and I look forward to discussing with you at the end of the presentation. So the presentation is called Making Critical More Than Human Futures, and as I understand, last week with the lecture by Andreas Weber, you were able to really delve into some of the philosophical aspects and theoretical aspects of speculative realism and Anthropocene and the more than human. So first, I'm going to give you an overview of my talk, talking a little bit about some of the projects I've done, Bauhaus Futures, a book that I recently edited, and then moving into discussing about the notion of artificial intelligence as a design material, touching briefly on some of the theories of the post-human and more than human, and then I'm going to talk about a few specific projects. So some of these projects employ prototyping, some of them video, some of them games, all of them at the intersection of participatory design and speculative design, and I'm happy to talk more about the details of working in those ways. And so I want to use those kind of as case studies to see how can we bring theory into the conversation around design. So who am I? I go by she, her pronouns. I identify as white, middle class, highly educated, living with a disability, privileged, Italian American. I think I'm human, and I sometimes also use the term disabled cyborg in my writing about disability. So if we start out thinking a little bit about the Bauhaus Manifesto, 100 years ago, setting out this new approach to designing the new man, this fusion of art and technology, artists and craftsmen, monumental and ornamental, creativity and experimentation, form follows function, simplicity and unity. And Walter Gropius in that manifesto said, "Together let us desire, conceive, and create the new structure of the future." So if I think about the last 100 years, I think a lot about the ways in which design, the white box of modernism, has been encased and enclosed in proprietary black boxes of technology. So the intersection between design and technology is what really interests me here. And I mentioned this book project, Bauhaus Futures, which brings together a number of authors around the question of what would keep the Bauhaus up at night if it were practicing today. And so I think of not only the well-known aspects of the Bauhaus, but also the lesser known and more radical and more creative and experimental parts, like some of the theater and fashion projects that were done. And one of the pieces that we published in the book was called Salvo's Diagrams for Another Bauhaus, suggesting that the field of design really needs a new set of ideas, a new set of topics, a new curriculum. So drawing on the original Bauhaus curricular diagrams, this proposal to think about computational systems, to think about new economic forms, and then to think about ecologies and the natural environment as a new platform for the field of design. So how did I get started in this area of study? So in 2003, I was in an elevator in Budapest, and actually it was 2004, I'm sorry. In 2004, and I was talking to a senior professor in my field, and I was a student in the field of communications and social sciences at Columbia University, and the senior professor told me, you can't study things that don't exist. And so I started thinking a lot about, at that time I was studying wireless community networks in Budapest and Berlin and collaborating with folks in Montreal and New York. And I was studying these wireless networks, but they were not yet on the radar. They were not yet mainstream phenomenon. So I started, my research agenda over the last 15 years or so has looked at emerging technologies, things that are not yet present in the everyday, but are experimental, are happening in the labs, in test beds. And so that's more or less how I oriented towards these types of projects. So over the last several decades, I've looked at everything from smart cities and autonomous vehicles to smart textiles and computational fashion and network medical devices and a range of other topics. And I'll touch on a few of them today. So this concept of the AI as a design material, it's actually been really nicely covered by a new issue of the Elisava Barcelona Design Journal, Themes in Design. It's also, you could say, has its precedent in books like Smart Things by Mike Kuniowski and Enchanted Objects by David Rose. And I think that's a really interesting leading conversation to be having, and it sort of threads through some of the work I'm going to show today. There's been a lot of course, critiques in recent years about AI and ethics, and so books like Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, or Meredith Broussard's Artificial Unintelligence, for example, that are really, from a social science perspective, critiquing the ways in which values and biases are embedded into our computational systems. And those are really important critiques, but I've been trying to think more as a design researcher, what can we do with that? And I've written some things about this in the Public Books website, Invisible Algorithms, Invisible Politics, in which I look at some recent books in the area, and also the case of the cameras that are installed in Chicago in urban systems, so traffic cameras. And at many of the research sites that I've studied, the constant refrain of the future is very present. So, for example, this picture from the University of Michigan Autonomous Vehicle Testbed, Connecting the Future, or at the Brooklyn Fashion Design Accelerator, Make the Future Here, or at the Urban Informatics Lab in Chicago, UI Labs, The Future Today. And I've been a lot more interested in not these techno-deterministic and utopian ideas of the future, but how we can make these critical futures. So how we can bring critical theory together with our experimentation with emerging technologies. So if you think back to the quote by Bruno Latour, "Why has critique run out of steam?" One of the things he says is the critic is not the one who debunks, but the one who assembles. So again, foregrounding the role of design and experimentation and inventive methods in critique. So Mike Michaels has written about this in the Journal for Science, Technology, and Human Values, talking about the ways in which designerly methods allow us to explore inventive problem making rather than solution seeking. And so that, he's talking mostly about speculative design and other approaches, these artistic encounters, the ways of engaging in the context of ambiguity, for example. And I think that article, What Are We Busy Doing? Engaging the Idiot, is a really great place to look at how social science methods and design methods come together around some of these themes. This is a well-known chart by Liz Sanders, a design researcher who's worked a lot on co-design and participatory design and convivial design methods. And here you can see the ways in which the critical design and cultural probes, the more artistic approaches in the upper left-hand corner, and then on the right side, the participatory Scandinavian tradition, and then sort of on the left hand, on the bottom, this idea of human-centered design, user-centered design, some of the lab-based studies, as well as the anthropological or ethnographic studies, and how we might see those methods as part of a broader landscape of ways to intervene in socio-technical systems. And I've been writing recently with my co-authors Jazz Choi and Denise Akera about this idea of situated automation, that we need to start thinking about participatory design that goes beyond human stakeholders and starts to think about our engagement with algorithmic creatures and the ways in which algorithms are having agency in our day-to-day life, in cities and in our experiences online, for example, and start designing with that in mind. This is a well-known chart by Dunn and Raby that looks at preferable futures, so how we might use speculative artifacts coming from the industrial design tradition to explore the preferable futures. And this is a way that I'm starting to think about organizing the range of methods that I mentioned. So here, this builds on Stuart Candy's Ladder of the Future, which tries to look at design and futuring and tries to distinguish between the generative and the creative forms like design fiction and experiential future, as well as maybe the more analytical forms such as design anthropology and future foresight methods. And this is helpful for myself and for my students in my Designing Futures course and critical context courses to try to be able to engage and critique around design projects that are very different from one another. Some of the projects are very poetic and creative and experimental. Others are more deductive and look at data sets and try to kind of come up with themes. And so ways of bringing those kinds of projects together into a conversation and still being able to really understand the value of each approach is really important to me. And here I'll just cover briefly a set of recent literatures around feminist futures that I think are important to highlight, maybe tied to Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto as one of the important works that allows us to rethink the binaries that have been very present within Western Enlightenment understandings of the human and the non-human, and try to find ways to complicate these and to explore the blurriness of these boundaries. Frida Kahlo, I think, if we think back to her, there have been a number of exhibitions about her recently, and I really think of her as maybe one of the first feminist designers because she not only painted on her beautiful body. She had a lot of accidents and some serious disabilities. So she had polio at a young age, and then also had a train accident, and these left her with permanent, scars and disabilities. And she painted on those, and those artifacts were shown in this exhibition. This way in which design can not only be about making up society and socio-technical systems, but also about intimately making oneself up and your own participation in the world as a design practice. This recent book by Daniela K. Rossner on critical fabulations tries to also suggest a series of new design approaches, looking at alliances, recuperations, interferences, and extensions, rather than the traditional human-centered design focus on individualism, objectivism, universalism, and solutionism. Also important, the design justice work by the network around design justice, and also Sasha Costanza-Chalk's recent book that looks at understandings that go beyond ethics and values and towards notions of equity and justice that are not exploitative. And so to really rethink your role as a designer from facilitator, from one of as an expert to more of a facilitator of processes and engagements. Bartzel's and Bartzel's Feminist HCI is another interesting suggestion about the ways we need to commit to our methodologies and create new types of relationships between the researcher and the researched, or the experts and the informants, we used to call them, and to really be much more reflexive about our methodologies and our approaches. And most recently, the data feminism work by Catherine D'Annunzio and Lauren Klein. This book suggests that we need to more carefully examine power, challenge power, elevate emotion and embodiment, rethink binaries and hierarchies, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. So if we think about human-centered design as this focus on singular human users, users as subjects and users as consumers, I want to propose that we start thinking about those from a more than human perspective, and I'll illustrate towards the end and through the projects what that might look like. So my work is really at the intersection of
performance and how, like Nun said, and Yuan said also about.
Can I continue?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the intersection of these three themes, the more than human, inventive methods, and the sort of affective or embodied themes. And in the inventive turn, we might include things like autoethnography, critical making, material speculation, practice-based design research, research creation, experiential futures, and Afrofuturism as all being areas that scholars in the social sciences and humanities are getting a lot more interested in ways of intervening. And a lot of these overlap with the field of design. In terms of the affective turn, we might look at this notion of focusing a lot more on the sensory experience, the body, first-person research, and what's been recently also referred to as in-body interaction. And for the more than human turn, we, are orienting more towards a new set of conceptual languages and vocabularies. So from experiment to experimental, from optimization to imagination, prediction to possibility, persuasion to speculation, control to indeterminacy, perfection to fissures, universals to differences, solutions to questions, exploitation to symbiosis, and transmission to translations, and nodes to relations. So drawing on, a really wide body of theory from science and technology studies and feminist new materialism and other areas to see if we can use a new set of vocabulary to drive our design interventions. Anab Jain with Superflux Studio has written about the more than human in her speculative work and coming up with another set of vocabularies I think are worth exploring. And in recent years, I've published a number of articles that try to review the different theories that are sort of embedded within some of these conversations on the more than human, and these include actor network theory, feminist new materialism, speculative realism, non-representational geography, and transhumanism. And you can read more about that in recent articles in both the Shiji Design Journal as well as Design Issues, but I'm not going to go in too much detail about those today. But some of the key questions that I do ask in that work is who or what are the users, and for whom or what should the design be desirable? How and in what ways are capabilities, agencies, and power distributed across human, machines, and natural systems? What new knowledges, questions, stakeholders, and partnerships are needed in order to adequately design for this problem? And how are ethics, values, and responsibilities reflected and embedded throughout the design process? There are a number of important critiques of the post-human, and these are primarily coming from critical race studies, critical disability studies, critical gender studies. And, here, one of the arguments is that the category of the human has been exclusive and exclusionary. And so thus, it makes no sense to move to, a kind of new version of a post-human dialogue without first addressing the ways in which people have been dehumanized and excluded. However, I'm noticing there's a lot of nuance here, and some of the even more recent publications are actually referring to the ways in which, so for example, Zakiya Iman Jackson's book, Becoming Human, looks at the ways in which, drawing on Black women's speculative fiction, such as Octavia Butler, how there have been these unruly relations and unruly boundaries. And she talks a lot about how we might maybe understand a post-humanism that's embedded within those works of fiction. And so I think that we can maybe begin to dialogue a little bit more about how and why some of these newer concepts like unruliness might be useful in understanding how these boundaries are shifting in what it means to be human. So in my own work, this is where I'm going to start talking about the empirical projects. And so I'll touch on a number of projects. And as I mentioned, I am trained as a social scientist, but over the last 10 years, I've been working also as a design researcher, meaning often collaborating with fashion designers, architects, game designers, and others to create new ways of intervening in some of these conversations that I mentioned. And the first one I'll touch on very briefly is about this concept of post-human subjectivity and my own use of network medical devices and the stories that I tell from an autoethnographic perspective. That's part of a book project that I'm working on called Automated, a Memoir for Other Futures. And the punchline of this project is I'm type 1 diabetic. I use a smart insulin pump. And the punchline is really, this AI system is keeping me alive, but it's also ruining my life. And if you want to read more about that autoethnographic work, I'll point you to this article, The Danger of Intermittent Algorithms, on the Public Books website. It's my most recent publication on this topic, and I think it will give you a good sense of some of the ways in which human, non-human kind of boundaries are challenged and where non-human agency plays a role in my everyday life, particularly waking me up in the middle of the night, sometimes every hour, in conversation with this system. So the one design project that I've done on this topic has been a collaboration with a fashion designer named Sky Kubaka, based in Chicago, and she focuses on crip, queer fashion, fashion for people with disabilities. And so she and I collaborated on this project, which I kind of called Pancreas at the Pool, but this is basically a prototype for a bathing suit that would also accommodate a pouch for an insulin pump. So that was a very interesting process in terms of, meeting with her in the studio, choosing materials, measuring, the sizing and trying it on and things like that. So that's the one design project I can mention that's related to that kind of post-human subjectivity theme. From here, I'll move on to talk a little bit about more than human labor and the future of work. This project, conducted with Megan Halpern, a professor at Michigan State University, was funded by Open Society Foundations, and our goal was to engage social and economic justice groups in a conversation about robots, automation, and the future of work. So we conducted about 10 interviews prior to designing a game. And this game actually goes 3,000 years into history and explores the themes of technology and labor in different historical contexts. So The interviews that we did helped us to design the game, and then we ran the workshop, which engaged about 30 participants from a wide range of backgrounds, including academics, but also, as I mentioned, about a third of the participants were social and economic justice advocacy groups. And we use the game as a way to expand the temporal boundaries of our sort of day-to-day work. So one of the things that we found in the interviews was that the work of nonprofits and social and economic justice groups in particular, of course, being very much based on the funding opportunities, the electoral deadlines that were coming up, the campaigns and issues that they were working on, making it very difficult to think very far into the future. So typically these groups are working on a 1 year, 2 year, or 5 year timeline. And we wanted to find a way to really expand the horizon. So we, instead of going 1,000 years into the future, we went 3,000 years into the past. And we played this game for a couple of hours actually at the workshop. We had 2 groups of 12, each playing the game. And at every moment of the game, there were opportunities to invent, for example, a workers' justice campaign for agrarian workers in ancient Egypt or fishermen in ancient Greece. And then following the playing of this game, we moved on to actually starting to prototype some future technologies or bringing things to life that might embed the concerns of the social and economic justice advocacy groups. So here is an example of a piece that was built, with these kind of everyday materials, cardboard boxes, tracing paper, felt, punch cards, and that was actually a future technology. And so in the paper that we wrote about this project, we have some examples of the kinds of things that were created and sort of what the purpose of these objects was. And what we found with this project is that by moving into the hands-on prototyping, we were able to get away from just verbal conversation and into that kind of material engagement and a more generative way of working with these concepts around automation and the future of work. The next project I'll show is the one on the driverless city. So this is about more than human landscapes and autonomous vehicles. This is a project that was funded by Illinois Institute of Technology through a grant that was given, and we were in the first year of getting this award. There were 53 teams that were applied, and we were one of 3 teams that was awarded with a $100,000 grant from the university to bring together all the departments that you see here, so architecture, engineering, design, landscape architecture, and we also had an external legal consultant on the project. And with this project, we were really interested in trying to think about what kind of urban spaces we might want in 30 to 40 years, and how might we leverage technology to get there, but trying to get beyond techno-determinism and really thinking more about how we might create visions of the future that were desirable, more broadly. So one of the things that was created as part of that project was an issue mapping of all the various topics that we thought were related around 4 specific areas. So we talked about delivery spaces, street spaces, mobility spaces. I think there was one other one. I'm trying to remember. Parking spaces being the 4th. And this piece was actually published in the New York Times in the design section one year. And so that was an example of, here's a close-up of that piece. And it, for us, it was a way of making sense of all of the topics that we might need to think about. As soon as it was published in the New York Times, we started getting calls from people that had been mayors and cities saying, how can we use this map? And for us, it was really more of a discursive tool, a way of talking about these topics and organizing them. It wasn't really meant to be a toolkit of sorts, more of a mental, kind of mind map of the issue. With that, I'll just read to you a field note from the future. This is from our visit to the University of Michigan testbed for autonomous vehicles. So So one of the ways in which autonomous vehicles are made visible and present is through these urban test beds. And these are, urban test beds as well as these simulated experimental test beds such as this one. And so in April 2015, we actually visited the University of Michigan's M-City, which is a simulated real-world city. M-City is real but not real, a lab but at the same time in the wild. Simulated, but not entirely a simulation. And here's a brief excerpt from our field notes. Head north on Route 75 towards Flint, said the scratched green sign. We stopped carefully at the flashing red light in our rented black Chevy Tahoe SUV, and then proceeded on the ramp towards Grand River Avenue on Route 5 and through a tunnel. We turned slowly to the left, taking note of the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit, past a canopy of trees and went over a short, narrow bridge. Now, just past the traffic signals at the railroad crossing in the intersection, we could see the colorful facades of familiar stores from a small town in the Midwest emerging in the distance. The adjacent sidewalk was dotted with garbage cans, mailboxes, benches, street lights, fire hydrants, and parking meters. A painted bike lane curved along the right side of the street along the curb. We turned right onto Wolverine Avenue, down State Street, and headed towards Pontiac Terrace. Somehow, we were right back where we started. We could have driven around all day on an infinite loop, but never arrived anywhere at all, and certainly not any closer to the future of the city. So, I mean, you can see the test bed from above, and I think you can imagine that most of the things that I described were actually donated and simulated. So, for example, the facade of buildings was actually just printed on a large, sheet of vellum or kind of a plastic material. The trees were actually just metal cages, and all of this to test the wireless communication systems that were, for these kind of connected car projects. And you could see that within this field note, I've done a combination of a literal description of what we did see, but also kind of a moving towards a kind of fiction in which, we never arrive anywhere at all, or a kind of the poetry of kind of writing it up more as a story. So that's one way in which I think we can think about inventive methods at some of these test sites, or when we're studying emerging technologies, for example. Here you have actually one of the urban plans that our team worked on. So we imagined more dynamic use of space. So the fact that spaces could be quickly shifted from use by vehicles to use by pedestrians. And I think perhaps what we're seeing now with the coronavirus, with these pop-up restaurant spaces that are happening in the parking spaces, at least here in New York, is a good example of how quickly things can be turned into kind of more dynamic uses if, given the political urgency. And our project was shown in the Vienna Biennale as part of an exhibition on the future of work. And one of the things that we did in the project was to also prototype a kind of a tool for brainstorming, again, about this issue. This is our first brainstorming session that we held on the train on the way to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And ultimately, these, the first version of that being sticky notes and, kind of analog. And then we tested it out several times and then ultimately decided to design, with an industrial design firm. We actually designed this with Martin Kastner from his firm Crucial Detail, but it's a set of 100 tokens with the terms that we came up with beautifully inset on copper in a kind of walnut wood. So they're more like poker chips, and so the idea was, again, to use this by grabbing a set of tokens and then coming up with stories about the ways in which autonomous vehicles might play out in urban settings. So now I'm hopefully going to show you a short video that we made. We made 4 videos as part of this project, and I'm hoping that it's going to work well on the screen sharing. Let's see.
1936, pockets of Chicago and new centers Naperville and Joliet had become so congested with last-mile delivery vehicles that aerial drones began replacing autonomous vehicle delivery, thus reducing the need for the sprawling warehousing and distribution centers that populated the Chicago metropolitan area throughout the 20th century. Class I railroads, originally the key to Chicago's role as a center of manufacturing and distribution, have been largely superseded by platoons of autonomous trucks and truck trains up to several miles in length. The North American Land Bridge, running from Los Angeles to New York via Chicago, is the last remaining profitable railroad that hasn't transformed into a development company. It is owned and operated by UPCSX, a merger of the Union Pacific and CSX railroads. To maintain profitability, double-stack container trains traveling the corridor reach up to 3 miles in length. Former trackage, their rights-of-way and intermodal freight facilities are still owned by BNSF, CN, and other companies, but now they lie fallow, serving as ad hoc nature preserves and wildlife corridors, as nature reclaims the formerly active transportation corridors. Platooning vans disperse regionally to irrigate markets with fresh produce. At the same time, electronics, furniture, and even autonomous vehicles produced through the vast global supply chain are also ubiquitous. The need for social connection and the demand for hyper-specialized goods has assured the viability of in-place retailing throughout the region. Purchases made in person can be located and transferred from a truck house and delivered within minutes or hours to any location. Persistent trade imbalances with China and Southeast Asia have led to networked markets for recycling. UPCSX fills empty containers with waste products for return trips. The consequent closing of landfills has therefore become a significant planning challenge for public authorities hoping to recoup some value from those sites. With the ability to detect potential collisions, including wildlife, from long distances, roadkill has become largely a thing of the past, thus contributing to overpopulation of certain species. In response to homeowners' complaints about deer, coyotes, and other large mammals, the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Indiana relaxed regulation and opened new areas of hunting throughout the territory. Many former drivers and warehouse workers have developed seasonal hunting and trapping services. They supply on-demand food with fresh meats, catering to the public's appetite for regionally specific foods. The popularity of locally sourced cuisine contrasted greatly with the nearly complete outsourcing of most other forms of production. The vast tracts of warehouses abandoned by industrial property developers and third-party logistics companies have also proven to be fertile ground for many gray market industries. These vast landscapes of exchange, born in the 19th century, had served their purpose, and now needed a new role to play in the 21st century. Once separated from our cities and hidden from view, they became testing grounds for new forms of production and civic life.
Okay, so that's an example of one of these speculative videos, and I think, it was actually quite difficult to get the tone of this type of work, to get the tone right, because I've shown this video many times to many audiences, and often it is understood as, an evangelization of this technology when it's really meant to be a critique. So that's something we can talk more about, I think, in the Q&A, is about how to frame the range of ways of working. This one is around the theme of post-human collaboration and computational fashion. So this code to wear prototype that I worked on with two fashion designers, Mina Cow and Amy Sperber, as part of a summer program at I-Beam. And this, we basically set out to create a men's dress shirt out of 3D printed. And we, in the early parts of the project, we were really trying to create something on the screen that would look exactly the way that we wanted it to. But we realized that when you're using algorithms to design, you actually have to learn more about what that program is trying to achieve, and you have to collaborate with it rather than assuming that you can over-determine the design. So one of the first examples of our project, when we printed it at Shapeways, they sent us a video, and the project was just like a pile of spaghetti. It didn't have any rigidity to it, didn't stand up. So we obviously had not achieved what we were going for. And so that was an interesting process of learning, how do you change the parameters so that you get out what you want. And in the end, we ended up printing and creating this 3D printed men's dress shirt, which we then added these kind of gold cords and dyed it in the color blue. And so this element, again, trying to really work across boundaries and thinking about both the digital and the sort of physical, and the craft of it and all of those aspects. We are also interested in gender binary here as well. And so that's one project. Another one that I've spent the summer studying in 2017, this is a project called Textiles at the Brooklyn Fashion Design Accelerator, which was using knitting, new knitting machines, digital knitting machines, together with Arduino and programming to make a set of 30 textiles, so 30 new kinds of ways of bringing electronics together with textiles. And so I was the ethnographer on the team, so I was mostly studying what the teams were created, but you can see here things like a knitted speaker. There are actuators of different kinds. So using zippers to change, the electronics. So finding ways to use light and conductive thread and these other elements together. So in the end, so here's an example of 3 of those projects, but you can see, putting LEDs into these digitally knitted pockets, using our just using QR codes and things like that. So that was a project that I was able to observe. And then another project, this is one called Biomaterial Matters. This one, the concept behind it was based on Lisa Onaga's work. She's a historian of silk. And we were trying to figure out what kind of a prototype could we use to kind of complicate human and non-human boundaries. And we started thinking about the silkworm and how silk as a biomaterial fits better into the human body. And in fact, it's often used in eye surgeries in South Korea. And so instead of putting the non-human and fitting it into the human, we thought, well, maybe we can make a cocoon and fit the human into the cocoon. So that was a project where working with the fashion designer Galina Mihaleva and a Japanese literature expert Anne McKnight, we created this prototype, which was shown at the Science and Technology Studies Conference in Boston. Then lastly, I'll show a couple of student projects just to give you a sense of the range of work in some of the classes that bring together participatory and speculative methods. This is a mapping that was published in the design journal Diseña, published in Chile. And we looked at different claims about the future. So, for example, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And then my students actually researched the history of some of these comments, and 2 of them had their work published in this article. And you can see it there. It's available, should be available on my website, but I can provide more citations. Let's see. Then a number of projects that have been entered into the Biodesign Challenge, which is another interesting opportunity to think about future applications of biotechnology. This project called Future Perfect was one in which the idea was that, you're tracked from birth, and you, for example, you get your college admission letter on the day you're born. And so it was this dystopia of, what would happen in a society where everyone had, ultimate information about all aspects of their life, intended to be a cautionary tale. This project Notes from the Sea was recently presented at the Primer Conference by Renee Albrecht, Mallinger, and Siwa Ma. And this one looks at the kinds of ways in which plastic pollution and other human impact on the oceans is creating new kinds of animal species. And so the idea is to invite participants into kind of a sketching of these speculative creatures that emerge at the intersection of our human impact on the ocean and sort of these evolutionary animals, sea animals and things like that. This is a game called Critical Loop. All the information is available to download for free online, and this is to look at the Internet of Things, and it has a set of values cards and a set of affordance cards that allow more inquiry into this question around, ethics and the Internet of Things. And we prototyped it with a group of business students, and they actually were really appreciative of the way that it raised new questions that they hadn't thought of in their own work on the Internet of Things. This project on cultured meat, there's a video available at Core 77 if you're interested. This project is called Meat Up, and it was looking at the future of cultured meat, and it was an amazing experience because we sat down to have a dinner party, and we expected to be discussing some of the values and ethics issues for about an hour while we had dinner, and we were still there 5 hours later discussing the kind of ethical implications of cultured meat. And so I think that's really the ideal for the speculative work, is whether it succeeds in engaging a discursive conversation around the prototypes that allow us to think differently about questions related to the future of these emerging technologies. And lastly, this project, Storytellers, looks at the integration of social media into fashion. And so this is kind of a prototype that you can see that seeks to communicate that theme. So again, just to wrap up, we, for the last several decades, the human-centered design paradigm has been very strong in most design schools, and it has really focused on the individual human user as a subject of our research and the designer as an expert. And I'm suggesting, that we start thinking more about these entanglements between human and non-human, the user and the non-user, the singular and the multiple, and that might mean intersectional identities and intersectional impression, or also multiplicity in terms of pluralistic futures. We might think more about participation and collaboration, and we might think about users not as consumers, but rather as repairers. And finally, the AI as a more than human design material suggests this set of concepts that, some of which I touched on throughout, but the idea that of coevolution, of indeterminacy or uncertainty, generosity, living with, imagination, difference and relations. And for me, for my own, project that I mentioned around network medical devices, for now, I'd settle for an AI system that sleeps through the night. And with that, many of these projects have been written up into full articles. So if you're interested, there are a lot more details that you can read in those papers. And now I would really just like to open up to questions and hear about the projects that you're working on, or the kinds of questions you have about using inventive methods, participatory and speculative design in your own work. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Well, I loved your presentation. Well, you know that I like your work very much. I think that it's important because it other perspectives to the critical futures, for example, in the sense that you are not like criticizing from an analytical or even philosophical point of view. Like your perspective is not, it doesn't have like the radicality of other philosophies, but it has, if you allow me to say this, like the serenity of certain social sciences, because you take the time to observe from the perspective of an ethnographer, and it's not like a quick impression. You go there and you observe the practice and you take part of it and you talk and you discuss to the people so you can understand the becoming and how can speculative design add like questions or problematize or open perspectives related to the possible futures. So my first question was related precisely to this. Because at some point, when you were presenting this speculative video related to automatic vehicles, the objectives of this particular project is to destabilize the socio-technical imaginary, is to criticize something that it's been endorsed by the industry, So we can say that this is one of the possible functions of speculative design. But then you name another project that was the future, that it's like a more dystopic one, no? So it works like a cautionary tale. And then you name a third one, which is the one about food. Now that it's basically a device to discuss and to open other imaginaries, no? So my question is, which other functions, besides these three that I've mentioned, like destabilize, create a cautionary and think in alternative futures, do you think that speculative design can have?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that I didn't really mention was more the experiential futures kind of work, where the idea is that you actually participate in a more theatrical way. So this is, one example would be the work that Stuart Candy has been doing, where the idea is that you enter into a new situation and you yourself play that role. And so I think that is one where there's an overlap between the history of speculative design and then the emergence of experiential futures, where it moves out of being an object, like a speculative design object, like a prototype or even a video, and moves into an experience. And that's where I think that's very interesting. I don't think any of the projects that I mentioned, are really truly in that vein, but that is one that I think is really important. And I think that's, in some sense, the project and writing that I've done on networked medical devices is the most similar, because it's an embodied experience of using a technology, and where your everyday life is, the choices that you can make are then changed depending on your participation and conversation with that device. And so, for me, that's the most, in terms of this theme of affect and sort of embodiment, that is the one that's the most obvious to me, but that's not really, that's not a future speculation. That's actually like a day-to-day experience for me. So I think that's an important one. And I'm very, very interested in the ways in which we can use experience as a way of either changing people's minds, creating new openings for new dialogues, new kind of questions. I think that's where there's a very interesting, body of work that's very relevant today.
Cool, thank you. Well, I have a bunch of questions, but maybe some of you in the audience want to ask something.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, or if they don't, meanwhile we can talk, and if they come up with some questions, well, you are always able to do so. I'm interested in the way you relate like speculative work, empirical research, but also your interest in like in ethical and political subjects, no? And and now you were talking about your own like self autoethnography or self ethnography. I don't know how to say it. Yeah, it's like with your body, no? And it kind of reminds me to Testo Yonki, this text from Paul Preciado, no? Well, he was like, and and I don't know, I didn't have this question prepared. It's just popping out right now, but. Do you think that a feminist speculative practice can be articulated more easily through unembodied research, or not more easily, no? But it's like through this kind of methods you can reach some insights that can really criticize the ontopistemic nature of the science with the big C, not the small sciences.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the things that seems to work really well about autoethnographic work is that I'm getting a little bit of like feedback, so that's why it's a little bit hard to smell it. I find and I've heard that students in courses where colleagues of mine have taught my work that's autoethnographic, students find it very easy to kind of understand and get engaged in the stories. So I do think that it helps motivate people to be interested in the types of theories because you're starting with a story that you can relate to. And there, rather than using it, you know, I'm not trying to tell those stories to draw attention to myself per se. It's not that interesting, you know, as a biography. I think what I find more interesting about it is a way to see how the theory, can help either make sense of your experience or how you can extend the theory or how. So for me, it's a very much more analytical use of those stories. It's trying to tell the story and then explain kind of, well, what's happening, because these network medical devices, are fairly new in the market. So for example, in the United States, this particular device has only been around for 2 years. And of course I could certainly interview other people, and I've certainly gone on online websites where people talk about their own experiences. So certainly I could validate that with a larger sample set, for example, of data if I wanted to do that. But I think there's just something not only that's really fun about that kind of writing. So it tends to be fun and it tends to be engaging. But it also helps me learn about the same questions related to kind of human machine or human non-human boundaries. So in a sense, it's kind of, it just happens that it's very related to like my earlier work in community networks and smart cities and things like that I can kind of learn about those same dilemmas, those same trade-offs, those same politics, in a way that just happens to be very embodied. And I think it's a way that other people can then relate to why do we need new theories? Why do we need new concepts? Why do we also need new ways of designing? And it just happens to capture those. I saw a couple of other questions here in the chat, so maybe I can try answering some of those.
Yeah, go on.
So one of them I see is AI as a design material. Can you develop further? Well, I think that, this is a question that's being posed in the field of design, right? So one of the things I've done in schools is, at least the one that I'm at, is that we have not been a very techie community, for example. We have not been, as compared to computer science or information science, where the main goal is to create new technologies. design has a very different history and a very different set of interests. And so I think of design, human-centered design in particular, even though some of the earliest projects go back to Lucy Suchman and the design of Xerox copy machines, or the Participatory Design Conference, where the whole goal is to design technology. I think that the materials that have been used in the design field have been fairly analog. Of course you have like computer aided design, but in the architecture field, now they already have a much more rich conversation, I think, about computational design, and that's led to, whole new kinds of buildings. And I think in the design field as well, we might start asking, what kinds of things can we do that are generative? And so for me, it was the computational fashion project in which I started to understand that when you use a program like Grasshopper and you run that program, you have to be prepared as a designer for the outcome, the range of outcomes and range of possibilities that you get. But you cannot over-determine or over-design from human will. It's a participation with the machine to see what kinds of parameters create what kinds of designs. And I think that can be really rich and interesting and generative. But yet also we know the social science kind of critiques that, AI, we have, there's bias and, that AI just mimics our structural inequalities and sometimes can even exaggerate those. So when we look at like facial recognition systems and things like that. But I do think there's a real opportunity for perhaps, new ways of designing if we'd learn more about AI, how it works and how we can work with it as designers. And I think there, some of these examples, again, they sound like they're primarily just marketing. So when you hear that like new flavors of beer are being designed by AI, or new, even in the biodesign or biotech space, like new kinds of materials are being created partially because of AI systems, right? So I think there's just a lot of interesting things going on there that we as designers, need to learn more about. And, and then there's also a lot of opacity, or, we don't really know how these systems work in a lot of contexts. And so that's another area that we really need to be aware of, the fact that we might not be able to explain what we get at the end. And that's one of the biggest issues with the opacity of the system, or the lack of transparency, and large companies, of course, dealing with this every day in terms of, Google might design something, but if they can't explain how that AI came to that type of design or conclusion, it becomes a challenge for the researchers, to not be able to have transparency around those things and what they're being designed. So, I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but I do think that it's an interesting realm, to explore. The next question I see is about the different scales of speculation, and definitely this idea of like from machine landscapes to, for example, clothing. And I think that's, in a way, if you think about an anthropological perspective or an ethnographic perspective, often requires that you kind of zoom in and out at scale. In some sense, I wish that rather than having like 10 different projects that all operate kind of at different scales, perhaps I would have a more consistent, set of stories to tell you if I would take that one object and look at it from many scales, which is what, if you think about Anna Singh's work on the mushroom at the end of the world, she really does that amazing job of like taking that mushroom, but explaining how it's like connected these, networks of economics and of human laborers. And so I do think it's an approach that's more common maybe in ethnographic work or in anthropological work. And I think from the perspective of speculation, it really does add richness to your project if you can kind of zoom in and out in that way. But perhaps it might make sense to choose a single object of study and like zoom in and out around that topic. What I have is more of a body of work that I've done over the last 10 years or so that often has taken different objects of study, but again, still around the computational and what that might mean. What does that mean for cities, and what does that mean for us as individuals as well? But yeah. Okay. You see this question of hyperstitional theory. I haven't heard of that. I haven't heard of that particular term. So, Andrea, perhaps you could explain a little bit more.
Yeah, like this bunch of philosophers in the 90s in the Warwick University, Nick Land, David Fisher, Mark Fisher, and the history of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, and they talk about hyperstition. Hyperstition as this. Well, you know what a hyperstition is, more or less.
No.
It's like it's like when the future it's haunting the present and it's trying to fulfill itself through hype loops. No, so the information starts to circulate. And a particular phenomena that it's projected in the future realized in the present. And I was thinking about this concept of levels of realization because they reject the difference of reality and fiction, no? So they talk, instead of this, they talk about levels of realization, no? And when I was looking at that beautiful story about the semi-simulated city in the university to test a technology and a kind of using and a way of using cash that was not existing, it made me think about this idea of levels of degrees of realization, no? Like understanding something like in the becoming, no? And I was wondering if you were like using this kind of trying to, because maybe you can score how fictional or not fictional it's a project and how, but looking at it in this mesh of social technical mesh that you research on.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of that. I didn't know about that body of theory. What I often find that there are theories that circulate very widely in science and technology studies, for example, that are completely different than the ones that circulate in media theory, but often are talking about very similar things. So I think it's one of those cases where, for example, in the article about the post-human, I try to give a set of the landscape of theories that are all quite different and come from very different perspectives, but yet are touching on these same kind of dilemmas around the human and non-human and how and where to draw the boundaries. I think I very much, of course, appreciate Donna Haraway's work and the way she talks about fact and fiction just being like one more binary. However, I do say that, I guess, with some caution, because obviously today we're living in a world in which, fake news and fiction and the disinformation campaigns are actually quite problematic in terms of how we understand the world. So while I'm very happy, as you can see, with these kinds of projects to try to be playful and use kind of, like, for example, the Future of Work project, this counterfictional history. So we're inviting people to create artifacts and things that can act in history. So you could say it's almost like a revisionist history. Again, that would be it can be very problematic, but it can be also playful. So I'm hopeful about the playful, experience and use of the speculative and the videos and the games, and I find that to be a useful way to engage. But I also think, and this is why I made the chart that tries to kind of show you can have critical and empirical projects, or you can have really kind of poetic and experimental projects, and they can be on a continuum. I'm not sure we need to like rate and rank them, but we should know what we're looking at. So that, I think that again, that issue relates to the how do we frame what we're doing. And I can tell you that it's been very difficult to show speculative videos about technology in particular to groups that have a different, maybe different theoretical background or different attitude, especially towards technology. So if you talk to, I would say, you know, in some of the social justice organizing groups, the general attitude towards technology is one of extreme, I would say it's like maybe more of a Marxist orientation. And there's just a belief that technology is never going to be used really to benefit workers. It's only going to be to cut their jobs, make their lives more punitive. So for tracking and surveilling. And so it's very difficult to have that conversation about what a more kind of maybe more utopian relation with technology might look like, or how we could, again, destabilize the current imaginaries around technologies and put forth others, use the momentum that, the fact that there's constant enthusiasm around technology from, government and from Silicon Valley and from lots of different areas, but use that productively to orient towards the kinds of futures that we might actually want to achieve. And I think it's just very, very difficult to frame the projects correctly so that the audience or the people that you're in dialogue with can have a generative conversation there. So I think that, it's one thing if your work is to be put in a museum and then it's going to just, it's going to be an artwork for the perspective of maybe the art crowd or the design crowd, that's being one of the biggest critiques of speculative work. But it's another thing if you really want to use it in a discursive setting, in a workshop or in a conference or in a policy dialogue, then you really have to frame it in a way that allows people to understand what's going on. Otherwise, you risk being conflated with kind of a techno-deterministic, techno-optimistic crowd, and that's exactly kind of the opposite of the point. So I think that it takes a lot of work to know how to present that to audiences that are not already familiar with critical design and speculative design.
What you are saying, it's super interesting, and then I let you answer this last question. But yeah, because sometimes, like from the perspective of speculative design or experimental design or critical theory, it's like we don't talk to a particular audience because we are not aware of the fact that our designs or our communicative device, they perform an agency in the, they create worlds or they destroy worlds, no? So yeah, it's something that I encourage to think about to the participants of Post-Inertia, because today they were presenting the statement and so on. So it can be like a super nice exercise to precisely to activate your speculative artifacts or devices. And I led you with this last question.
Okay. Yeah, so this last question, how did any insight in the design of experiences in terms of generating it, how does it differ from the design process of products for just, I mean, the way that I like to think about it is that these are all research processes. So as research processes, that means that, there have to be moments where you're primarily looking for examples. So one thing I think about a lot with my students is design precedents. Like, what are the positive design precedents? So for example, have there been previous, whether it's videos, products, services, systems, examples like within history that sort of support the point of view that you're trying to achieve. But then also I think about negative design precedents. Like, are there some warning signs or what went wrong historically? So there, in the social sciences, we spend a lot of our time writing cases or writing theories and articles about things that went wrong or things that should have been otherwise, right? So we always talk in STS, like, what could be otherwise? Like, how could the world be different? But we don't propose that in a social science article. That's not our job. Our job is primarily documenting what went wrong. So I think as a designer, can you, in the futures community, they talk about a lot about like signals of change. So looking for counterintuitive examples of activities or behaviors or things that are happening. But I also think it makes a lot of sense to look at both positive and negative design precedents and looking at using that as an input into your process. And I think whether you're designing for traditional human-centered design or for a speculative project, you still have to take the research process quite seriously. And I think where the experimentation and the exploratory nature and the kind of generative and fun part can come up is often, and actually learned this somewhat from the COVID, the game that Andrea and his collaborators in Becoming created, this, is that when you're in a situation and when you're playing a game and when you have some facts and data to kind of work with, then you can really generatively create and name and really build out those worlds in a really rich way. But you have to have some starting points and some building blocks, and I think those can come from research, and that can be historical research or signals of change as they do in the futures area. But I think taking it seriously as a research process is important. It's not just starting with zero and imagining something in your head, because if you do it that way, your projects are probably going to be extremely overshadowed by your own biases, your own experience of the world. And so if you really want to be doing these more like pluralistic types of speculations about alternative futures, you have to expose yourself to a wide variety of material. And so, going and reading things like Ursula K. Le Guin or Octavia Butler, feminist science fiction writers and Black fiction writers, that's a way to gather facts about the world that you can then use in a design process because, they're out there. So I think just taking the research process very seriously and rigorously and using that before you start kind of imagining the possibilities. And the last thing I'll say is just like removing the typical constraints. So a lot of times I've seen in classes working with design students that they're very concerned about making something viable from a business perspective. And unfortunately, that means that they never get to push the ideas as far as they can go because they're always like, well, how would the business model work? That's not possible. So I think to a great extent, and this comment has been made, I think, by many theorists that, that perhaps we've lost our ability to really imagine. And maybe that's something that has not been offered, like, let's say, certain political orientations that have not done a good job of like focusing our imagination on a possible future that's pluralistic. But some of that is already out there. It's in feminist science fiction. It's in other people's experience of the world, right? So like people who are not like yourself. And of course, like most recently we've gotten, our attention has been pulled, during COVID on the racial health disparities, for example, or on the economic declines that are hitting Black-owned businesses, or on Black Lives Matter, right? So like we have now, because of COVID and having everything kind of pausing, our attention has been pulled, perhaps in a different way or at a different intensity than it had been in the past. So I would say that that's the most important thing, is really just exposing yourself to a real wealth of facts and ideas about how different the world is if you are not, in your own in your own daily experience, but if you're getting into other experiences. Yeah. So it's been really a pleasure speaking with you all today, and I hope your projects are going well. And I mean, feel free to get in touch. All my contact information is on my website, lauraforlano.org, and the articles are fairly easily available also on the website, but feel free to get in touch if you want to continue the conversation or, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. What you were saying precisely, it has all to do with Post-Inertia School, and this is why we invite different working groups like to address like alternative imaginaries of people that are already working on them. So yeah. Well, thank you.
Cool.
Thank you very much for all your super useful insights and well and inspiring and yeah, we'll be in touch.
And will the work of the Post-Inertia Summer School, will that be on the website?
We have to. We are discussing it, but of course you are invited to the final presentation. It will be next Friday, not this Friday, the next one. So if you want to show up, you will be super welcome, and it will be a honor for us.
Okay. Wonderful. Take care, and great to be with you all again.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you again, Laura.
Okay. Ciao.